He was a prodigy, an innovator, an industrialist, and he became one of the most influential American business leaders of the 20th century. But this titan of industry had a dark side, a deep-seated anti-Semitism that would come to shock even his most ardent admirers. Henry Ford was not satisfied with sharing his hatred towards the Jews privately. He made a point to share his views with the world. And one man in particular took his words very much to heart. This is Star-Spangled Fascism, the Titan.
What's astonishing is that Henry Ford is an American hero. So people don't know that Henry Ford embraced extremist ideas. They don't know that Hitler admired him. They don't know that he admired Hitler. And they have no idea that he was the foremost exponent of anti-Semitism in his own day and time.
I'm historian Bradley W. Hart, author of the award-winning book Hitler's American Friends. In this podcast, we're examining fascist leaders and movements that have emerged here in the United States over the past century. We'll look at what fueled their authoritarian ambitions, the supporters who flocked to them, and the Americans who stood in their way. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at 20th century industrialist Henry Ford, one of the country's most prominent business leaders. An engineering visionary who shaped the very landscape of the United States with his Model T automobile. At one point, Ford represented half of all vehicles on American roads. But over time, this captain of industry became more open about anti-Semitic views that were shocking even by the standards of the time. But Henry Ford didn't keep his visceral contempt for the Jews a secret. He weaponized it on a global scale. He was born on a farm near Dearborn, Michigan in 1863, in the darkest days of the American Civil War. His father, William, was an immigrant from Ireland and was described as a taskmaster. Henry's mother, Mary, instilled him with traditional Protestant morals of the time. Dearborn wasn't the big city, and there were only limited educational opportunities there. In fact, Henry attended school in a one-room schoolhouse until the 8th grade. His instructor taught the young Henry using a series of texts known as the McGuffey Readers.
The McGuffey Readers were a graduated set of books to teach children how to read.
That's Dr. Pamela Nadell, the director of the Jewish Studies program at American University.
They were first developed in 1836, and they were written by a Presbyterian minister. They sold 120 million copies. This is in an era when there were far fewer millions of Americans. But the thing about the McGuffey Readers is they were decisively Christian. When you say that Henry Ford is a product of the 19th century, we have to understand the role of Christianity in America and its powerful ideas about the Jews. The readers talked repeatedly about the perfidy of the Jews, that the Jews called for Jesus' murder. And so across Christianity, there's this hugely powerful idea about the Jews as having committed deicide, the murder of God, and also being associated in nefarious ways with money.
But the young Henry Ford wasn't particularly interested in history or theology. He was an engineering prodigy. As a young man, he'd seen early engines operating as threshing machines on farms in Michigan, and he began to wonder whether that same principle could be used to change the way people get around. He started experimenting with his own machines, and at the age of just 33, he built his own internal combustion engine automobile, called the quadricycle. Ford founded the Ford Motor Company in 1903, and he got to work developing the automobile that would make him famous and incredibly wealthy, the Model T.
Henry Ford is the person who made ownership of an automobile possible for the masses of the American population.
That's Nancy Beck Young, chair of the Department of History at the University of Houston.
Before Henry Ford, the production of cars was exorbitantly expensive and really a rarity for only the wealthiest of the wealthy. After Henry Ford and the assembly line, Model Ts could be purchased for around $250 to $300. And many Americans bought their first cars in the first couple of decades of the 20th century.
And that innovation didn't just mean that Americans could have shiny new toys in the driveway. It radically changed the way Americans lived, worked, and vacationed, and even their love lives.
People could live farther from their place of work because the car meant the possibility to traverse greater distances in less amount of time. The shape of cities changed as a result as suburbs ringed further and further out from the city core. People were able to take vacations in ways that just had not been possible for the masses in the 19th century. And as such, whole new industries were born, such as the motel and drive-through restaurants. But perhaps the most interesting change of all came with how Americans fell in love. As a result of Henry Ford's automobile, young couples no longer courted with parental supervision. Instead, Americans dated, meaning that they went solo with one another in automobiles, and that was a revolutionary change.
The first Model T Ford rolled off Ford's Detroit assembly line in 1908. By 1918, half of all of the automobiles on U.S. roads were Model Ts, giving this former Dearborn farm boy an immense share of the marketplace and making him a multi-millionaire. And that rapid rise to fame and fortune made Ford an inspiration to millions of people.
So Henry Ford is of a piece with what historians like to talk about as the Horatio Alger myth, the notion that anyone who's just willing to work hard enough can make it in American society. That is certainly Ford's story as a tinkerer and an inventor, and he makes it rich, and his name is synonymous with the emerging middle-class prosperity of the 20th century with the rise of the automobile. So Ford's rags to riches story merges with the story of the automobile that causes more Americans to feel prosperous as they're able to own this luxury good, making Ford something of a hero. For people of a certain generation, no other car type other than a Ford could possibly be owned because of the admiration people had for Mr. Ford and the way he had changed the way they lived their lives.
So by 1915, Henry Ford is rich and famous. He's a hero and an icon to millions of Americans. And now this business titan decides it's time for Americans to hear more about his views on the current events of the day. This is a year into World War I, the biggest conflict in world history up until that point. The US is still neutral. We won't even get into the war until 1917. But even though his own country isn't in the war, Henry Ford feels the need to speak out. He's a pacifist, and he sees it as his mission to help end the war raging in Europe personally.
So as he's being courted by pacifists, he realizes that he has a platform to use his financial power and his prestige to shape how the public views this situation.
He was persuaded by a number of Americans that he could launch a peace ship that would go to a neutral country and it would manage to end the war between Germany and England and the other countries.
It's a really weird moment. Henry Ford, a business leader, not a politician, is convinced by some pacifist leaders to commission a ship voyage to Norway. The idea was that Ford would assemble a ship full of prominent intellectuals, politicians, and business leaders. Then he'd send telegrams to all the capitals of Europe, inviting diplomats, prime ministers, and even possibly monarchs to meet with his group in Norway. They'd sit down, hammer out a deal to end the war, and that would be that.
Before Ford set sail, he granted an interview in which he bragged, "We're going to stop the war. We're going to get the boys out of the trenches by Christmas."
It's quite frankly a crazy idea that a ship full of American peace activists could single-handedly stop a massive war that has millions of men literally in the trenches. And it goes about as well as you might expect. First off, the American press roundly mocked Ford and the peace ship before it even left the US. Then, halfway across the Atlantic, most of the passengers caught the flu, including Ford himself. By the time the ship reached Norway, Ford was sick, embarrassed, and knew he had already failed.
The ship docked in Oslo, Norway on December 18th, 1915. And Ford gave his first and only press conference of this campaign. His speech was, in a word, confusing. And mainly all he did was talk about a new tractor that he was bringing to market.
The press panned Ford's press conference appearance, and the American businessman beat a hasty retreat back to the U.S. on the next available ship. The peace ship initiative had been a complete failure. There's a certain amount of dark humor to be found in the peace ship incident. But the mission's failure carried darker consequences than anyone at the time could have imagined. Because after he came back to the U.S., Henry Ford claimed that during the voyage he discovered the true reason why the war was happening at all. He blamed the Jews.
So Ford's anti-Semitism became obvious as a result of the peace ship episode.
He openly told friends that Jewish bankers and financial interests were behind the war because they were making money off of it, a classic anti-Semitic libel. Ford soon decided to take these private views public.
In 1918, Henry Ford acquired the Dearborn Independent, which was a small-town weekly newspaper. Not something that one would think would have tremendous impact on national or international affairs. But nothing could be further from the truth given what Ford did with the newspaper.
In the newspaper, he published excerpts from, and newspaper stories about, a book called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. This book was an anti-Semitic tract that was probably a forgery produced by the Russian secret police in the late 19th century. It was basically a big conspiracy theory that posited two things that seem pretty contradictory.
Thing one, that Jewish people were poor and impoverished, incapable of making it. Thing two, which if it sounds contradictory, it is, posits that there was a cabal of Jews who had as their purpose to govern the world's economic affairs and the world's military and governance affairs. That there was, put simply, a Jewish conspiracy underway to run the world.
The conspiracy theory is that the Jews are so powerful financially that major European governments are in debt to them, and so that they really are the puppet masters behind the throne.
None of this is true. Absolutely none of this is true. It was racialized libel designed to scapegoat Jewish people and make it possible to blame society's ills on a particular category of human beings.
But there's language in the forged protocols that casts Jews in an even more twisted light. It's the idea that Jews actually feed upon the blood of Christians, known as the blood libel. It's one of the darkest anti-Semitic myths in world history, and it goes back thousands of years.
They need the blood of Christians, generally Christian children, in order to fulfill their religious rituals. And what people don't remember is people tend to think about the notion of Jews conspiring against Christianity, against Western civilization. We associate it with the protocols of the Elders of Zion. But even the very first recorded blood libel myth also talks about the Jews around Europe deciding where they're going to commit ritual murder. So the notion of the Jews as a people, a nation, a religion without a homeland, conspiring across national or regional borders goes back to the Middle Ages.
Ford not only apparently believed these libels, he kept publishing articles based upon them, first in the Dearborn Independent, and then in a 4-volume text entitled The International Jew, The World's Problem, that gets distributed all over the globe and even translated into other languages, including German. Some historians think that these articles were mostly written by Henry Ford himself. And because of Ford's wealth and influence, they reached a huge audience.
How many people read the Dearborn Independent outside of Dearborn, Michigan? Quite a few, as it would seem, because the Dearborn Independent was owned by Ford. What was covered in the Dearborn Independent was picked up by other newspapers. And more importantly, just about every new Ford automobile purchased would have a copy or two of the Dearborn Independent on the front seat of the car when one drives away with their shiny new black Model T.
Henry Ford was, I think, inarguably the greatest anti-Semitic propagandist in the English language in the history of the world.
That's MSNBC's Rachel Maddow, author of Prequel, An American Fight Against Fascism.
His Dearborn Independent became a nationwide fire hose of the most potent, most dangerous anti-Semitic propaganda the world has ever known.
But Henry Ford's impact on American anti-Semitism and the emerging fascist movement in the U.S. won't stop with publishing articles in a newspaper. When we come back, we'll look at Ford's influence on a young Adolf Hitler, an aspiring fascist at a critical moment in world history.
Wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
Henry Ford's anti-Semitic views weren't a secret. You'd have to have been living under a rock in 1920s America to not know what he believed.
Thanks to the International Jew, thanks to the fact that every Ford Motor dealer in the country was handing out copies of the newspaper for free, his newspaper by mid-1920s was the second largest circulating newspaper in the United States, which is astonishing for a local newspaper. And Henry Ford actually is one of the reasons why the protocols are still around today, because he published them and didn't bother to copyright them.
Ford's anti-Semitic texts even speak to his views about a supposed moral decline in America.
Ford goes after what I would say is an emerging modern urban American society.
That's Dr. Pamela Nadell of American University.
So he goes after Jews controlling Hollywood. He goes after Jews in music. He goes after Jews and the baseball scandal. And everything that he sees as emerging in modern America, in contrast to the world he grew up in, he sees as evil, and the Jews are at the root of it.
And the sad reality is that for some Americans who idealized Ford, his anti-Semitic views shaped their own.
They think that what he is saying, it has to be true because he's such a powerful and such an important figure. And of course, we have multiple contemporary examples where people think if someone says something and they're in a certain kind of political position, then what they say must be true. They would never spread lies. The reality is that people talk about anti-Semitism as the longest hatred, the most enduring hatred. The Jews don't fit into the scheme of Western Christian civilization.
Despite being condemned by Jewish associations, Christian groups, and even President Woodrow Wilson for his comments, Ford was unmoved. He said, quote, "The Jews are the scavengers of the world. Wherever there's something wrong with the country, you'll find the Jews on the job there." End quote. And the words of the Dearborn Independent weren't limited to the US either. By the mid-1920s, Ford had found a new fan in Germany who was reading his articles with a lot of interest.
In the years that followed, with the rise of fascism in Europe and more specifically the rise of Adolf Hitler, Ford found that he had a new supporter in the form of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler admired Henry Ford greatly.
Vor allem diese Anfrage Herrn Roosevelts an uns durch eine Anregung ihrerseits oder wenigstens mit ihrem Einverständnis erfolgt sei.
But Ford's relationship with Germany wasn't limited to the admiration of the future Führer. Ford had business interests in Germany too. He'd been building and selling vehicles in Germany since 1926. In classic Ford style, he decided to build his own manufacturing plant in the western German city of Cologne.
It has to do with Ford's pursuit of wealth.
That's Dr. Nancy Beck Young of the University of Houston.
He is forever seeking out his own fortune, and he has diversified his production internationally as well as in the United States.
In 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. One of Henry Ford's most devoted international fans was now in charge of a major country, and he didn't shy away from his admiration for this American titan of industry. Hitler immediately set to work putting his personal anti-Semitism into action, a prejudice that he shared with Ford.
Adolf Hitler loved what the Model T had done for Americans and modeled the Volkswagen, the people's car, in Germany after Ford. Adolf Hitler kept a photo of Ford in his office. Henry Ford was the only American spoken of positively in Mein Kampf. Only once, but I think this is a case where once is more than enough. And so there is this almost love fest, if you will, from Hitler toward Ford.
That love fest resulted in one big gesture of appreciation by Hitler, too. In 1938, a German consul general gave Ford a big gift for his 75th birthday. It was a medal called the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, and it was the Third Reich's highest civilian honor for foreigners. There's a famous photo of the German diplomats pinning the award on Henry Ford that day in 1938. He's beaming from ear to ear.
So this is an award that is given to honor people that Hitler liked. Now, it is worth noting that Ford did not go to Germany to receive the award. He instead received the award in Michigan. He tries to do a small amount of distancing by not traveling to Germany, but emphasis here is on the word small.
And, needless to say, that Ford plant in Cologne kept cranking out vehicles. But over time, the German authorities took more and more control over the plant. Soon, it was producing trucks for the German military, and it would keep producing military equipment until nearly the end of the war. It's perhaps not surprising that given his personal views and his business relationship with Germany, Henry Ford publicly opposed the idea of the U.S. intervening in World War II. In fact, he associated himself with the country's leading anti-intervention group, the America First Committee.
The America First Committee came into being in the late 1930s as it looked like the world was on the verge of another world war, and that the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration would, through its alliance with the British, lead the United States into war. So the America First organization comes into being to try to thwart American progression toward military involvement. And their purpose is to propagandize against the war and make the argument that the responsibility of the American government was to the American people first, America first.
But Ford's public anti-Semitism from decades before made him a difficult ally for the America Firsters to publicly embrace.
The problem with Ford is all of the attention that he is getting from Hitler in the form of the award and the knowledge of Hitler's admiration for Ford. Another reason why Ford is becoming a problematic figure is because of his own anti-Semitism. He says the quiet part out loud with regard to prejudice against Jewish people. And wrapping all of this together, he was too much for the America First Committee.
The result was that while Ford would privately back the America First Committee, they kept his name out of most of their public pronouncements. But everything changed with Pearl Harbor. The America First Committee shut down within days of the attack on the American fleet in Hawaii. But Ford's operations in Germany didn't.
Ford is a curious figure, to say the least, when it comes to the military history of World War II. Too many U.S. history textbooks, everyone that I've ever read, celebrates his River Rouge plant in Michigan for its role in supplying the munitions for American victory in the war. That is true. What is less well known in American history textbooks, at least, is the fact that Henry Ford was also operating a plant in Germany that played a key role in constructing munitions for the German war effort. So Henry Ford had one plant producing for the Allies and another plant producing for the Axis.
There's no doubt that Ford made a major contribution to the American and Allied war effort. In fact, the company built an entire aircraft manufacturing facility called the Willow Run plant that cranked out B-24 bombers for the US military during the war. But that all took place against the backdrop of his anti-Semitism and the Ford plant still operating in Germany. The Ford factory in Cologne kept building equipment for the Nazis until nearly the last days of the war, when it was, ironically, liberated by American GIs. The war ended in 1945, and this titan of American industry died in 1947 at the age of 83, the wealthiest man in the world at the time. He had changed the way Americans fundamentally live and helped the US win the war. But his personal prejudices had made him an inspiration to anti-Semites, including Adolf Hitler. Ironically, many historians have largely cast Ford's sordid history with global anti-Semitism and his influence on international fascism aside.
One cannot study or talk about Henry Ford and his industrial accomplishments without also paying significant attention to his political endeavors, which included anti-Semitism, support for fascism, and endorsement, certainly implicit, and one could make the case also explicit endorsement of the Hitler experiment in Germany. It's just that simple. Henry Ford was exactly that problematic a figure on the international stage at the moment in the 20th century when the democratic order was facing its greatest test. People don't want to believe something that venal about a figure who was largely revered in the way that Ford was. What we've got going on here is several factors colliding. The fact that no scholar has really dug in and foregrounded the story of Ford's fascism and anti-Semitism, and the unwillingness of Americans to see a hero sullied.
The way you invent an American hero is that you whitewash the past that doesn't fit that stereotype. So people don't know that Henry Ford embraced extremist ideas. They don't know that Hitler admired him.
Jeden dieser genannten einzelnen Staaten, wenn es wünschen sollte und sie selbst nach Deutschland mit einem entsprechenden tragbaren Vorschlag wenden.
They don't know that he admired Hitler, and they have no idea that he was the foremost exponent of anti-Semitism in his own day and time. What I would say about his lasting influence is that for Americans, he remains a hero. They don't know about his anti-Semitism, and I hope the podcast will get a lot of listeners and will understand it, but he's flawed. People are flawed.
Our special thanks to Pamela Nadell of American University and Nancy Beck Young of the University of Houston. In our final episode of Season 1 of Star-Spangled Fascism, we'll talk about the man who was once branded as America's #1 fascist intellectual. But for all the controversy he generated, few people suspected the secret that Lawrence Dennis concealed his entire life from even his closest friends.
He decided he would pass as white, and it would come as very shocking news to people who followed him in the fascist movements that he was part of starting in the 1930s to know that he was not white himself.
This program was edited by Brian Fantinelli, mixed and mastered by Joseph Powers, and executive produced by Brendan Gokel. Be sure to subscribe to the Star-Spangled Fascism podcast wherever you get your podcasts, on our YouTube page, and follow us now on social media. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Dr. B.W. Hart. I'll be posting previews from our upcoming episodes there, and feel free to leave your comments. If you have a question about the podcast, email us at questions@starspangledfascismpodcast.com. I'm Bradley W. Hart. Thank you for listening.